Welcome back, folks, where truth and reality have a seat at the table. Well, as a child and well into young adulthood, I, along with millions of others in this country, lived under the specter and fear of communism. And now, thanks to the Democrat Party, which historically gave us everything bad from its inception, and particularly since the Civil War, it is now controlled by the communists in this country. Having poured the foundation, that is, the Democrat Party having poured the foundation for communism a long time ago. Here's what you have forgotten and what your children are ignorant of because of their public education. Some of your kids are saying you're not so sure about communism, and some think that it sounds pretty good. Well, let me remind you of the Communist Control Act of 1954 passed by Congress. Congress actually outlawed the communist parties and prohibited members of communist organizations from serving in certain representative capacities and to prevent others from coming into this country, much less becoming citizens. That's how dangerous and evil it was considered to be back then and is now. You have been lied to and conditioned. The Communist Control Act of 1954 is still the law and on the books today. It is not being used, and if ever there was a time to resurrect it, it is now. Communism, having a history of being the most corrupt and evil form of government in human history, having murdered over 120 million people in the last 100 years, as well as enslaving over 1 billion, let's not forget the hundreds of thousands of American military men and women who have died to protect us from it. We now have communists in Congress. In the famous words of Dr. R.C. Sproul, what's wrong with you people? Are you suicidal? Do you need some mental therapy? It makes me sick to my stomach that so many Americans have died in defense of this country because of communism, only to have this generation finding it acceptable and allowing it into our government. Communism supports and stands for everything that is unconstitutional. Perhaps this is God's judgment for the 70 million abortions that we legalized. You have to admit that in that light, the judgment would be a just one. The pity of it is that too many will suffer, and oblivious to the fact that they have earned it and deserve it. Today, people are oblivious to the cause and effect. They don't understand cause and effect. The only exception to judgment being rained down upon us as a just consequence is the young children of today who don't deserve to suffer the consequences of our sins. Now, in my podcast, I talk a lot about people in government and political leaders from around the country because I'm not only connecting the dots for you, but I have listeners in nearly all the states. They need to hear what some of their leaders in their states are doing. So what happens in one state can and does affect you in your state. Well, let's start with some examples of those from other states that are destroying the fabric of this country with their incessant lies. Once again, Senator Cory Booker of New Jersey is giving us another dose of his baseless and factless opinions. He recently accused the White House was for sale, and that as Attorney General, Todd Blanche, who is up for confirmation, would be one of the most corrupt law enforcement officers ever. Really? There he goes again. There goes Booker again with baseless and factless accusations and opinions with nothing to back it up. And why? Because he knows you would rather assume than investigate. He and his kind depend upon you being gullible and accepting of everything they say. This is one of Booker's favorite accusations because he himself is so well acquainted with corruption. He lives it every day. Now, being from New Jersey, it's probably a waste of my time trying to educate most of the folks there. But let me leave this topic with this thought in mind. I have observed this reprobate for a long while, and I believe there is a Graham Plattner hiding somewhere inside of Cory Booker. And I've been 100% right about these things along with my psychoanalysis of these people because they wear their dysfunction and corruption as a calling card. Just stay tuned. Well, moving on to all the morons in Kentucky who voted for our leftist Nancy Pelosi Governor Andy Beshear, who thought him to be such a fine Christian and a moderate Democrat. Well, folks, the cloak is off, and I predicted this and I saw it coming a long time ago. The cloak is off and the deceit is here. And just a few nights ago in an interview What did he do? Well, he started making apologies for socialists. He's not a Christian, nor a moderate, folks. He's not the moderate you thought he was. He never was. I've listed for you in previous podcasts many of his lies, proving him to be a pathological liar. And as all good Christians should know from their scripture, liars will not gain entrance into the kingdom. He is no different, folks, than all the other Democrats. He's a fraud, and he's a socialist pretending to be moderate, just like Governor Spanberger of Virginia pretended to be, who fooled Virginia voters into thinking that she was moderate. Then, the day after she was sworn in, she started her radical communist agenda to destroy the Electoral College and our system of government. She even attempted confiscation of guns in violation of our Second Amendment. As for Kentucky's governor, all you have to do is look at Beshear's record and the things that he has said and supported. He's no different than Nancy Pelosi or Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez or Zoran Mandami. Well, moving on, here's a visual of another Kentucky moron. As I was stopped at a red light, this car was in front of me. And on the right side, they want Christ to stay in Christmas. And you saw a nativity scene. And then on the other side of the back bumper is a Bernie Sanders bumper sticker. Yes, Bernie, an atheist communist. So how does this moron think that Bernie will have any sympathy for someone who thinks Christ needs to remain in Christmas? This is the type of person, maybe a falsely assured Christian, who cannot identify evil. This picture is a perfect example of the idiocy in this country and among Christians. Well, here we go again. Here's Senator Ruben Gallego of Arizona, who has been caught up in a scandal having had sexual relations with 2 Capitol Hill staffers. Of course, Gallego blamed MAGA and it being a right-wing conspiracy, but remember, he was buddy-buddy with Eric Swalwell of California, who had to abruptly resign after he was found out doing the same thing. This is just like Graham Plattner of Maine, who they tried to force upon us with all his perversions. Plattner's perversions were so voluminous, popping up every day, they had to get rid of him, even though the people in Maine had voted for the pervert. These corrupt Democrats, who always are so sanctimonious and falsely empathetic to everything that is destroying America, are all the same and cut of the same cloth. They are totally corrupt with tons of baggage, but that's exactly what those who control them want. Now think about this. The powers to be know that these people are compromised, but they want it that way to keep them under control. To keep things hidden and secret, these elected frauds will do anything and do the bidding of those who helped put them in office. So once again, the root of the problem is not the blossom on the weed, but the root, such as all these communist non-governmental organizations and the likes of George Soros types. Gallego is another Democrat who has to go. Now we have news from President Trump. He gave a national address on Thursday, and in that national address, which was boycotted by ABC and NBC, China was exposed as having played a major role in subverting and interfering with our elections. As proof of it, Trump declassified scores of documents and investigations proving the complicity of the Communist Democrats with the Chinese, who are ideological bedfellows. The first reaction to the speech from the radical Democrats in Congress was to call for Trump's impeachment. But one thing they didn't do is ask this question: is the classified information that has been declassified and released to the public true? They don't want to know that. They know it's true, and they want to bury it. The Democrats and Chinese are working together. The Democrats are in a panic because now they have been exposed for the traitors that they are. There are so many of us who have known this and been warning the public about it for a long, long time. But the forces on their side were well funded, and their proxies in the news organizations like ABC, NBC, and CBS were successful in suppressing it. If strong measures are not taken to indict, prosecute, and incarcerate those guilty of this treason, then, as I have been saying for so long, we will lose our republic, and the misery that will be visited upon us in this country and its people will be unparalleled. Once the people find themselves in a state of misery, they will never connect the dots, nor understand the cause and effect of their conduct and their voting being connected to the people that they keep electing. Once again, and I've said it hundreds of times, so many of these voters are like dogs who will return to their vomit and re-elect their persecutors. I have zero sympathy for them because they've earned their misery. Now, I'm going to give you parts of Secretary of State Marco Rubio's recent and very important address that he gave to the growing extreme left and Marxist communist growth spreading around the world and in this country. And I'm adding in some of my own commentary and remarks, and it is important that you hear this very clearly. Rubio referred to an industry that had grown up in our country to knock down any discussion with regard to this threat as minor or right-wing conspiracy theory. But now we know that has all been a lie, as we see communists now winning elections from New York City to Seattle, Washington. Some within this industry that was designed to squash the news of the advance of communism were in our news medias, as we have just seen with ABC, CBS, and NBC News, who refused to even cover the president's national address dealing with China's interference in our elections. Rubio said that we should deal with this threat as if someone had just broken into our home and that you were defending your family. Well, I can tell you how I would defend that. I would do it with my Second Amendment rights. Clearly, they don't want to fight an armed populace when they come to bust down your doors. This is the greatest evil on the face of the earth, folks, along with Islam, which are nearly identical twins. Secretary Rubio said in a recent address to an international gathering of leaders that it's time to crush once and for all the evil of the left. There are many on the left in our country that will justify acts of violence as legitimate forms of political speech. Folks, these are true insurrectionists. They are the masters of projection and will accuse you of everything that they are doing and planning. Civil War 2.0 is just around the corner, and the question is, will freedom-loving Americans be able to mount any significant type of resistance or fight given the technology that exists in the world today? Just think about it. President Trump released classified information on Thursday last that the major news networks, except for Fox News, tried to keep from the people, revealing that China had accessed the voter information on 220 million American voters. The decision makers in those news media outlets should be prosecuted, jailed, and the keys thrown away. Those outlets must have their licenses removed. Left-wing violence is being excused in our large cities who have been overtaken by the communist left. Criminals are allowed to roam free in these sanctuary areas. The major cities in this country have been taken over by people in positions of power who have repeatedly dismissed acts of violence and even terrorism as legitimate forms of political expression so long as they served the left-wing cause. And it is why during those George Floyd riots in the summer of 2020, as criminals and extremists burned and looted their way through America's great cities and nearly brought the country to its knees, were called peaceful protests. City governments around the country simply refused to prosecute the people conducting these acts of violence and terror. We recall the infamous image of a news anchor from a very prominent agency standing in the neighborhood consumed in flames. Meanwhile, the chyron on the bottom of the screen read that the protests were mostly peaceful. What pathological liars these people are. They need to be chased out of the world. This was something worse than a double standard. Left-wing violence was not just excused, it was treated as sacrosanct, as a protected class unto itself. That has to end, and if you don't remove the Democrats from office, we are going to devolve into a Civil War 2.0. Folks, this is exactly what the Confederacy did leading up to the Civil War. The definition of a sanctuary zone or city or state is nothing less than the defederalization of our republic, and I condemn our Supreme Court for not calling it as such and ruling accordingly. Secretary Rubio recounted stories of examples of leftist violence around the world and in our country that is on the rise, and I lived during those times. He reminded everyone what too many have forgotten. Here's just a few. We remember the Weather Underground, which bombed the Pentagon and bombed the State Department and bombed the Capitol. We remember the Black Liberation Army, which staged armed robberies and executed police officers at point-blank range. We remember the Symbionese Liberation Army, which shot a public school superintendent to death with cyanide-packed hollow point bullets. In an 18-month period between 1971 and 1972, the FBI counted some 2,500 bombings on American soil, a rate of nearly 5 a day. The overwhelming share of that violence came from left-wing extremists. Oh, that's right. You have forgotten. Or were you just never told of the evils of the left because you were being taught by them? Between 1970 and 1980, 93% of terrorist attacks in the West came from the far extreme left. These are numbers that would shock most Americans today because we've been taught to believe that this kind of political violence simply doesn't exist or it's being exaggerated. But it does exist, folks, and we're actually understanding it, and our nation wears the scars to prove it. Today, we face a new wave of this old evil here in the United States. The share of left-wing terrorist attacks and plots has risen to levels not seen in decades. In Germany, far-left violence has jumped by more than 40%. In just the last year alone, in Greece, more than 80% of radical violence is now driven by the far left and anarchist actors. These are not abstract statistics, folks. Americans have seen what those numbers mean as there has been an all-out assault on our immigration officers, from sniper attacks, explosives, armed ambushes by transgender shooters opening fire on Catholic elementary school students as they prayed. The shooter's gun was marked with slogans like, "Where is your God now?" Then there was a healthcare executive executed in cold blood in the streets of New York City. There have been multiple assassination attempts on a sitting president, and the murder of the greatest conservative activist of a generation, Charlie Kirk, a man who happened to be also a husband and a father of 2 young children, shot and killed while speaking to a crowd of students. This is a distinctive and unique evil, folks. It has always been driven by hatred above all else, a hatred for civilization itself. It is a revolt of the worst against the best. It's a revolt of the weak and the cowardly against the strong and the good. It is perpetrated by those who cannot build, who cannot create, who cannot achieve great things, and they take their revenge upon the world for their own inadequacy by seeking to destroy those who can. This is what radical leftism is. It may wear and has worn various different slogans and ideologies and disguises over time, but it is all the same. They call themselves anti-capitalist or anti-imperialist or communist or anarchist or Marxist. But the fundamental character is always the same, folks. It's always the same. It is a poisonous resentment cloaked in the language of equality and justice, liberation, and overwhelming need to tear down what greater men have built, to wreck what is beautiful and what is right on behalf of people who are only filled with ugliness and have nothing else to offer the world. As Rubio continued in his speech, he said that through violence and through terror, they once again seek to impose their ugliness on all of us. None of this is driven by idealism. It is not utopian. In fact, it is the opposite. One of the criticisms you sometimes hear of communism, for example, is that, well, it sounds good in theory, but it never works in practice. That's actually not true. Communism does not sound good in theory. It is a license to murder under the guise of government. Communism and communists must be killed. History proves it. Kill or be killed. Cuba, Venezuela, Russia, China, Cambodia, North Korea, blood flows through the streets, and guess what? The people voted it in. Let's not do it in this country. World communism envisions for all of us a small, flat, gray, no level of exceptionalism world, a world drained of all that is good and noble in the human soul. The world that communism envisions is a world without courage, a world without creativity or ambition, a world without heroes or glory or great causes to strive towards. Communism is a world without miracles, without myths, without men who rise above the rest to do incredible and extraordinary things. And the world that communism envisions is a world without God. For these architects of revolutionary violence, the towering achievement of our civilization for them is an unbearable humiliation and a reminder of what they cannot do and a reminder of what they cannot be. They choose instead to destroy. Communism bankrupted the richest nation in South America, and that was Venezuela. And sadly, they voted for it. And almost 8 million people have fled the country in the last 10 years. If they take over America, where are you going to run? There is nowhere else. That is why we must fight and use any means to defeat them. And now that means the Democrat Party, now controlled by the communist ideology. Russian and Chinese communism murdered 120 million people in its own people in the last 100 years. A book was written and was called The Killing Fields. In Cambodia, the communist dictator there, get this, exterminated 1/3 of the population. And guess what? Most of you were alive when that happened. And how many of you knew it? And how many of you cared? Anyone who promotes or thinks communism or its other name, socialism, is a good thing, is a threat and an enemy of yours. How did this happen? You paid for it. You helped raise their army. It's the teachers and the professors and the teachers' unions in this country who have brainwashed your children and have groomed these radicals. So to what party do these extremists belong and are registered? The Democrat Party. The left have become very slick and savvy in picking people who appear and look normal, but are monstrous on the inside. And you can tell by the policies they support. The Democrat Party of today is your enemy. Again, you need to start defending yourselves as you would against a home invader while you still can. Well, I want to remark on one last thing before we close for today, and that is the imbeciles that sit behind the desks in front of the TV cameras telling you every night how the war with Iran should be fought. These people are only good at reading a teleprompter, and they have no facts nor intellect to figure out how to strategize a war. They are way overpaid readers and way out of their depth when it comes to foreign policy in the defense of this nation. The only thing they are good at is, through the power of suggestion, they deceitfully influence the American public, who are, for the most part, clueless and unengaged. And I'm talking about all media, including Fox News, where they're always raising the subtle questions of, well, we need to be more clear about what the objective is in Iran. I'm sick of hearing that question, and it isn't an innocent one. It's one designed to undermine what we need to do to defeat the enemy who has declared that they want to kill us. Folks, they have been murdering Americans for the last 50 years, and may Jimmy Carter burn in hell for his foreign policy, who helped create the radical Islamic State of Iran. Believe me, his decision was not an innocent mistake. I know the details around it. I lived during that time. I lived through it. And until these moronic talking heads have top security clearance and intelligence clearance and are sitting in with the president in the operations room at the White House, they are clueless about what they're talking about. So the next time you hear these talking heads demand that the president disclose his strategy while the enemy's listening, and they do listen, just tell them to shut up, because the enemy is playing upon the sympathies and the emotions of the American people. So what can you do about it? Well, call these media outlets, write letters, get threatening with the sponsors who financially back these news outlets, Bud Light them. We must stop trying to conduct a war by media, because they will lose the war for you. And what's at stake? Well, turn around and look at your children, because they will be the ones that will pay for it with their lives. That's answer enough. Okay, folks, well, that's enough to digest for this episode. Thank you for joining us. I'm Jack Richardson for Jack's Corner.